I should have never taken this job. The Whispering Pines Motel was one of those places that didn't exist on purpose. A rundown, isolated and tucked between endless stretches of highway and dense, unwelcoming woods. The kind of place that only desperate travelers, or people running from something, would stop at. I wasn't running from anything, just looking for work. The ad was simple. Night receptionist needed. Cash payment. No questions asked. That should have been my first red flag. But I needed the money, so I showed up. The interview. The lobby was unsettlingly clean, almost sterile. Faded floral wallpaper peeled at the corners, and an old ceiling fan spun lazily above the empty check-in desk. The silence was thick, unnatural, like the building itself was holding its breath. A man emerged from the back office, his expression unreadable. He was thin, with a neatly pressed suit that looked out of place in this decaying motel. "You're here for the job?" His voice was clipped businesslike. I nodded. He slid a single sheet of laminated paper across the desk. "Read these carefully. These are the rules." I frowned but took the paper. The list was short, but the rules, they weren't normal. Rules for the Whispering Pines Motel. Night shift only. 1. Lock the front doors at exactly 11:13 p.m. Do not unlock them until 6 a.m. 2. If the phone rings more than 3 times, do not answer it. 3. A man will arrive at 2:16 a.m. He does not have a reservation. Do not check him in. 4. If you hear footsteps in the hallway, but no guests have checked in, stay behind the desk and do not move. 5. If you see a woman in a white dress standing outside, do not acknowledge her. She will leave by sunrise. I let out a short laugh, expecting some kind of punchline. None came. "This a joke?" I asked. The man's face remained expressionless. "If you can't follow the rules, you should leave now." Something in his tone made the air feel colder. I swallowed hard and nodded. "Good," he said. "Your shift starts tonight. 11:13 p.m., the first rule." I locked the front doors right on time. The moment the bolt slid into place, a strange sensation washed over me, like the building had exhaled. I shook it off, chalking it up to nerves. For the first few hours, nothing happened. The motel was quiet, the only sound coming from the hum of the vending machine and the occasional groan of the old pipes. Then the phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times. I stared at it, my pulse quickening. Do not answer if it rings more than 3 times. It rang a 4th time. The sound was different now, distorted, like a voice was whispering beneath the tone. My fingers twitched toward the receiver, but I stopped myself. The phone went silent. A chill ran down my spine. I glanced at the clock. 2:15 a.m. 1 minute until the man arrived. 2:16 a.m. the visitor. Right on schedule, a car pulled into the empty parking lot. The headlights flickered unnaturally, casting jagged shadows across the pavement. A man stepped out. He was tall, unnervingly thin, his face obscured by the dim light. He walked up to the locked front doors and stood there motionless. Then he knocked. Knock. 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 I gripped the edge of the desk, my pulse hammering. Do not check him in. Knock. 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 I stayed still. After a moment, the man tilted his head back in an unnatural jerky motion, like a puppet with its strings cut. Even from inside, I felt his eyes on me. Then he grinned. I turned away, heart pounding. When I looked back, he was gone. The parking lot was empty. I should have left then. But I didn't. And that was my first mistake. The moment the strange man vanished, an unbearable silence settled over the motel. The air felt heavier, pressing against my skin like unseen hands. I forced myself to breathe, gripping the desk so tightly my knuckles turned white. I had followed the rules. And yet, something told me that wouldn't be enough. The clock on the wall read 2:45 a.m. I was halfway through my shift. I just needed to hold out a little longer. Then I heard the footsteps. Soft at first. A slow, deliberate shuffle down the second-floor hallway. Rule number 4. If you hear footsteps in the hallway, but no guests have checked in, stay behind the desk and do not move. I hadn't checked in a single person tonight. My stomach tightened as the footsteps grew louder. Whoever or whatever was up there, they weren't in a hurry. Each step echoed, the sound stretching out in the empty silence. I gritted my teeth and stayed put. Then without warning the footsteps stopped. Directly above me. I swallowed hard, glancing at the ceiling. The front desk was located directly below room 203. My gut told me if I went up there, I wouldn't like what I found. A sharp creak sent a shiver down my spine. Something was standing right above me. I clenched my fists trying to stay calm, but my body screamed at me to run. The weight of the silence was unbearable, like the motel itself was waiting for me to make a mistake. And then just as suddenly as it started, the footsteps moved away. Slow at first, then faster. By the time they faded, the only thing I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I checked the clock. 3 a.m. Still 3 hours to go. 3:30 a.m., the woman in white. I forced myself to focus. If I let fear take over, I'd lose my grip on reality. And if the rules were real, breaking them wasn't an option. I was still catching my breath when I saw her. Through the glass doors. A woman in a white dress, standing at the edge of the parking lot. Her face was turned away, her long dark hair flowing unnaturally in the still night air. Rule number 5. If you see a woman in a white dress standing outside, do not acknowledge her. She will leave by sunrise. My entire body went rigid. She wasn't moving. She wasn't breathing. She just stood there. I squeezed my eyes shut. If I didn't look at her, maybe she'd go away. The minutes crawled by. When I opened my eyes, she was closer. Not by much, but enough. She was now at the edge of the motel's driveway, just a few feet from the entrance. A low, suffocating pressure built in my chest. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I could feel her watching me, even though her face was still turned away. Do not acknowledge her. I looked at the clock. 4:12 a.m. I just had to last until sunrise. I tightened my grip on the desk, my nails digging into the cheap wood. I wasn't sure I was going to make it. I could feel the weight of the woman's presence outside pressing against the glass. Her figure had not moved. She remained frozen in place, her back still turned, as though she were waiting for something, or someone. I could feel her waiting for me to break. I had heard the rule. I had memorized it. And still I wanted to call out to her. To know who she was, to understand why she felt so wrong. But the rules were clear. Still, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder at the phone. The silence in the lobby was unbearable, and the hairs on the back of my neck prickled as I imagined the woman's slow, deliberate steps getting closer to the door. The phone rang again. Once, twice, 3 times. Do not answer if it rings more than 3 times. But this time, I couldn't ignore it. Something gnawed at me, pulling me towards it, urging me to pick it up despite the rules, despite my better judgment. I reached for the receiver with trembling hands. The moment I lifted it to my ear, the world around me shifted. There was no dial tone, no static, just heavy breathing, long labored breaths, as if someone or something was struggling to catch its breath on the other end. A whispering voice broke through the silence. "You've made a mistake." My breath caught in my throat. The voice was low, guttural, and ancient. It sent waves of ice down my spine. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. The voice grew louder, more urgent. "You shouldn't have come here." I pulled the phone away from my ear, staring at the receiver, as if it had become a living thing. I had no idea how long I stood there frozen, until the phone line clicked dead, the silence ringing in my ears. Rule number 2. If the phone rings more than 3 times, do not answer it. But I had done more than just answer it. I had listened. The moment I set the phone back in its cradle, I felt the air grow thick, like something was closing in. The oppressive weight in the room grew heavier, and the walls felt like they were pressing in on me. I looked outside. The woman in white was gone. But that didn't mean I was safe. The door was locked. The motel was empty. And yet something inside me told me I was no longer alone. 4 a.m., the man's return. I glanced nervously at the clock. 4:15 a.m. Just 2 more hours to go. I could survive this. I had to. But then the unmistakable sound of knocking came again. Knock. 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 My breath hitched. I didn't need to look out the window to know who it was. The man. I glanced nervously at the clock. He was back. And it was far too late for him to be checking in. The rule was clear. Do not check him in. The knocking continued. Knock. 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 My heart raced. I wanted to run. I wanted to leave the motel behind, to get as far away from here as I could. But the rules held me in place. They forced me to remain, to act as though everything was normal, even though I knew deep down that nothing about this place was normal. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay calm. Do not check him in. I watched the door through the corner of my eye, trying to stay out of sight. The knocking stopped. For a split second, there was only silence. Then the door handle began to turn. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The door slowly opened. I saw him then. The man, standing in the doorway with his head tilted back in that grotesque way. His lips stretched into a smile, and his eyes gleamed like they were burning through the dark. But what struck me the most were his hands. They were twisted, long, and unnaturally thin, curled into claws as if they belonged to something else entirely. I knew the rule. I had to ignore him. I forced myself to stay behind the desk, my eyes locked on his, unable to look away. He stepped forward, crossing the threshold of the motel lobby, his every movement deliberate. Then he spoke. "I'm here for my room," he said, his voice too calm for someone who shouldn't even be here. I couldn't speak. I couldn't make myself do anything except stare at him. Then he took another step closer. A heavy scent filled the air. One I couldn't place, but immediately recognized as wrong. It was the scent of decay. The man's presence filled the room, suffocating the already oppressive air. His eyes, wild and fevered, locked onto mine as if he were savoring the fear that had overtaken me. His movements were deliberate, measured. He knew exactly what he was doing. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed, stuck in the chair, unable to look away from those eyes. His eyes, the eyes of something that didn't belong in this world. "Room 203, he said again, his voice unnaturally calm. "I've been waiting for my key." I knew I shouldn't speak. The rules were clear. Never acknowledge anything beyond the desk. But the weight of his gaze was unbearable, pulling at me, forcing words from my throat before I could stop myself. I'm afraid that room is occupied," I stammered, my voice trembling. I wanted to add something else, maybe tell him he couldn't stay, but it felt like the very air around me was thickening, closing in. He smiled, and his grin seemed to stretch unnaturally wide, too wide for a human mouth. "Oh, I'm sure it's not," he said, his voice low as though mocking me. "I've been here before, you know. I've always been here." The words hit me like a slap. I had heard something similar before. The strange murmurs from the phone line. "Always been here." "Please," I whispered, a thin tremor in my voice. "I can't." Before I could finish, the lights flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. My head swam with dizziness, and for a split second, I thought I saw something, or someone, standing behind him in the darkness. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked away for a moment. But when I looked back, the man was no longer standing in front of the desk. I felt a cold gust of wind rush over me, sharp and biting, despite the air conditioning being off. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway behind the desk. But I knew there was no one else here. The only sound was the rhythmic clicking of the clock above the desk, its ticking growing louder in my ears. I stood up, my legs unsteady, every instinct screaming for me to leave the lobby. I had to follow the rules. I had to stay behind the desk. But something pulled me. I turned away from the desk and hesitantly began to walk toward the hallway. I had heard it. The footsteps. They were coming closer, but they didn't sound like they were coming from the hallway. They sounded like they were coming from the walls. I froze in place. The entire hallway had gone silent. No more knocking. No more shuffling footsteps. Just the endless, pulsing silence. The only sound now was my heartbeat, louder, faster, unrelenting. I couldn't see anything. Not yet. But I felt it. The feeling that something was watching me. A cold hand brushed my shoulder. The breath I had been holding caught in my throat. My eyes widening in terror as I spun around. But there was no one there. Then a voice, soft but unmistakable, came from the dark hallway. It wasn't the man anymore. No, this voice was different. It was higher pitched, a whisper barely audible at first, but growing stronger. "You shouldn't have come here." I gasped, the sound of my breath echoing in the silence. The voice was inside my head, like it was speaking to me from the very walls themselves. No one should have come here. I took another step backward, my pulse racing, my legs screaming at me to move, to leave. But the rules, the rules. Just as I was about to turn and run, something grabbed my ankle. I yelped in panic, stumbling forward as I twisted around. There was nothing there. The grip on my leg vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. But it wasn't over. The man's voice came again, closer now. Too close. I told you, he hissed from behind me, his breath cold and rancid against my ear. I told you I've always been here. I couldn't bring myself to turn around. I was frozen, rooted to the spot. Suddenly, the ground beneath me felt alive, like it was shifting, like the walls themselves were closing in. I tried to move, but my feet wouldn't budge. I was stuck, trapped in this place, and I had no idea how to escape. I could feel something dark, something old, moving in the shadows. Its presence filled the room, swirling in and out of sight, as if the very walls had become alive with malice. And then in the dead silence, I heard it, the sound of a door creaking open. Room 203. The door was open, and it was calling me. The door to room 203 stood ajar, an eerie invitation in the stillness of the motel. Its dark frame seemed to pulse with a rhythm of its own, as if breathing in time with my rapidly pounding heart. I could feel the weight of the air around me, thick with dread and anticipation, like something ancient and sinister had been waiting for me to make this very move. I wanted to scream, to flee, but my feet were rooted to the floor. My breath was shallow, ragged. Each step toward the open door felt like a small eternity, and yet, I couldn't look away. Something inside me, something buried deep, compelled me to go, to enter, to finally see what was behind that door. The hallway seemed to stretch impossibly long as I walked, the faint flicker of the overhead lights casting long, twisted shadows across the cracked walls. Every footstep felt like it echoed throughout the building, but the silence around me felt deafening. I had reached the threshold of the room, and my hand, against every rational instinct, reached out for the door. The moment my fingers brushed the handle, the temperature plummeted. A cold like I had never felt before washed over me, seeping into my skin, biting through my clothes, paralyzing me. I stepped inside. Room 203 was nothing like I expected. The decor was simple, outdated, with yellowed wallpaper peeling in some spots and broken light fixtures hanging from the ceiling. The air smelled stale, as though the room had been abandoned for years. And yet there was something familiar about it. Something wrong. The room was suffocatingly quiet, but that only made the pounding of my heart more pronounced. I scanned the space, half expecting to see the man, or perhaps the woman in white, standing in the corner waiting. But there was no one. It was empty. At least, that's what I thought. I turned toward the bed and there, at the far corner of the room, lay a figure unmoving, covered by a heavy blanket. The shape was distorted, as though something inside the blanket was too large. My stomach twisted, nausea rising, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. I took another step forward, and that's when I saw it. The blanket moved. Slowly, inches at a time. I felt my pulse quicken as I watched the shape beneath the blanket writhe, twisting like something was struggling to get out. A low, guttural sound filled the room, almost like a whisper, but distorted, as if the very air was alive and trying to speak. I could feel it then, a presence, a suffocating, malevolent force that was closing in on me. The walls seemed to pulse around me, and I heard whispers, faint but growing louder, coming from all directions. You shouldn't have opened the door. The whisper was cold, like ice crawling down my spine, and it came from behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The room felt as though it was pressing in on me, the walls closing in, the air heavy and thick with something that wasn't quite human. I tried to step back, to leave, but my body wouldn't obey. It was as though the room had a mind of its own, locking me inside with it. Suddenly, the blanket moved again, more violently this time. And then the hands emerged. Long, twisted fingers, their nails sharp and jagged, burst from the blanket, grasping at the air like they were reaching for something, someone. The figure beneath the blanket shifted again, its body contorting as though it were being pulled from the inside out. The hands reached out, fingers twitching, and in a voice that sent a chill straight through my bones, the figure finally spoke. You should have followed the rules. I could barely breathe. My throat was tight, my chest aching as though the very air had turned to lead. The figure slowly sat up, revealing its face, or what should have been a face. It was pale, ghostly white, and the features were distorted. Its eyes were sunken, hollow pits, and its mouth was stretched open in a jagged grin that seemed to go on forever. The figure's lips parted, and from deep within the hollow of its chest came a voice low and eerie, like it was coming from the bowels of the earth itself. "You're trapped now, just like the others." My pulse roared in my ears as I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The room seemed to grow smaller, and the shadows from the corners of the room reached toward me, pulling at my limbs, dragging me down into the abyss. I heard the phone ring again. The rules were clear. Never answer if it rings after the third time. But it was ringing. It was calling me, pulling me closer to it. It was the last thing I should do, but I reached for it, unable to stop myself. My fingers brushed the receiver, and the room shifted again. This time, the voice on the other end wasn't the man, or the woman, or any other figure I had heard before. It was deeper, almost demonic in its resonance. "You've broken the rules," it hissed. "Now you belong to us." I tried to scream, but the words were lost in the overwhelming darkness that had overtaken the room. I felt the walls close in, the air so thick I couldn't breathe, the pressure growing until it felt like my chest would explode. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the darkness swallowed me whole. I felt myself fall, as though the very floor beneath me had given way. I could no longer see. I could no longer breathe. Only the endless, oppressive weight of the dark. And then in the silence I heard it. The faintest whisper from somewhere deep within the shadows. "Welcome to Whispering Pines."